Namaste. Welcome to another session of Sangam Talks. First of all, आप सभी को गुरु पुरब की और त्रिपुरारी पौर्णिमा की बहुत बहुत शुभकामनाएं. So we are here for another interesting talk called as Haryana Century. So let me just introduce you all to our eminent speaker, Arjun Singh Ji. So he is an academic and policy professional. He is also the founder of Rath Foundation and convener of the Haryana chapter of the Indic Academy. So he has recently authored a book called as Land of the Gods, The Story of Haryana. So this will basically be an introductory session wherein he'll set forth the idea and intention behind this book. And he will also provide some interesting historical insights into this region, which marked the earliest phase of Indic civilization. And finally, he'll end on a brief account on how this is Haryana's time to outperform. So we'll also be having a part second of this talk, wherein he will be elaborating on the current scenario. So Arjun Ji, without taking much time, I'll yield the floor to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Guru Purnima, Guru Purab, or Tripura Purnima ki aapko bhi shubhkamnaएं. Hi everyone, my name is Arjun Singh Kadian and I've authored this book titled Land of the Gods, The Story of Haryana. The book is published by Rupa Publications, and as suggested by the host, this conversation is essentially going to be about me introducing the idea behind the book, the motivation behind the book, how I got into the process, the entire journey of writing the book. I was actually telling the host a while back as well that, in the early years, a few years ago when Sangam Talks had, just initiated working, I was also associated with the project, thanks to Rahulji, and, he and I have a similar kind of, motivation and have similar people who have guided us in the process. The foreword of the book is written by Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal, who is a best-selling author of the book Land of Seven Rivers and The Ocean of Churn, The Indian Renaissance, along with a fiction book, a collection of short stories, rather, Life Over 2 Years. He has been an inspiration for quite many years now. I remember meeting him early in Bangalore, where we, got into conversation about history writing, rewriting history, and understanding why there are certain chapters and certain stories in our history which are for no real reason or no reason just absent from our textbooks. And in that entire journey, in that entire learning process, I got to work on a lot of stories. I got to understand a lot of things about Indian history. And, somewhere down the line, I got interested in the entire project and went about, working on history subjects, history topics, so on and so forth. And somewhere I felt, that Haryana, where I'm born, where I live, where I work, has somehow been just absent in our history books. There's quite little information about Haryana that one finds. And, one reads about Mahabharata that was fought in Kurukshetra. One reads about the Vedas or, Saraswati River, Saraswati civilization. But after that, the entire journey or the entire story of this region is considerably absent in our history textbooks and in regular conversations. I've had people just randomly, making comments and casual comments, talking about that Haryana is probably, one that it's not written about, but two, again, that Haryana probably has no history. And that's absolutely shocking, because you're talking about a region which has essentially been, the land of gods, like the title of the book says, and I'll justify it in a while as well. But for the longest time, those casual comments and those stereotypes got, in some way, which just got permanent over the years by just people making these, uninformed remarks. That, of course, was a very, was a motivation behind writing the book. Then, of course, I've been somebody that, always wanted to work for Haryana. Haryana, I remember a while back. I was speaking to a friend of mine who I just, one of the first people you shared the book cover with. And he congratulated me, and his second line was this: "आप थोड़े हरियाणा को लेकर थोड़ा ज़्यादा emotional हो ना." And I couldn't think much but respond in a while that, of course, why not? In fact, this is the state which has essentially given me a sense of purpose and direction. And it's always your land that you probably give back to. So it's, nation first, and then a region comes, and you always want to do some in some way or the other give back to the society that has made you or built you, or been a part of your journey, however or wherever you are today. That is how the entire process and the entire motivation behind the book came around. Even when I was in those early days, I remember back in teenage years, and later, of course, during my graduation and during my early working days, I would keep talking about, keep learning about Haryana, keep understanding the various nuances of the state, which essentially got picked up, to a scale where I was making frequent trips to hinterlands of Haryana in order to just get into conversation with people. There's often a in sociology, you want to talk about this armchair intellectuals, and then there are groundworks and ground reports. I realized somewhere down the line that there's a drastic difference between how, say, for example, Delhi, Bangalore, or Bombay perceive Haryana, and how Haryana sees itself, or how Haryanvis see it themselves, and what Haryana really is. So there's a considerable difference between these three thought processes. And then the more I got into understanding, the more intrigued I felt. I just wanted to talk more about it, learn more about it, and in the entire process, somewhere bring out a product, bring out a book, bring out some sort of literature which helps in understanding this region better. And that, in all of it culminated into this fine book, which is Land of the Gods. It's published by Rupa Publications. It has endorsements from Baijan Jay Panda, who's the National Vice President and spokesperson of Bharatiya Janata Party. And the foreword is written by Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal. When I say, so this is one of the first questions when people ask me, why did I name the book Land of the Gods? See, Haryana is a region where for the longest time, there has been a continuing civilization. When we talk about, or there are people who make limited remarks of Indus Valley civilization, which now in many ways established by Sanjeev Sanyal among many other people, both popular writers as well as academic and research writers, that it's high time we call it as a Sindhu Saraswati civilization, an Indus Saraswati civilization. And Mr. Sanjeev Sanyal makes a very strong remark here. I'd like to quote it from the book. In the foreword, he writes, "The Rig Veda also mentions a sacred territory called Sapt Sindhu, or land of the seven rivers. The text does not name the seven rivers, except that Saraswati is one of them. Many historians assume that the seven rivers include the Indus, the five rivers of Punjab, and the Saraswati. This would be a very large area. However, a closer reading of the Rig Veda shows that the Sapt Sindhu only related to the Saraswati and its own tributaries. This would be a relatively small area between the dry river beds of the Ghaggar and the Chautan, that is roughly modern Haryana. And hence, in the foreword, in the very beginning of the book, we establish it pretty well that Haryana is the region which was essentially the land of seven rivers. It was here that the tribe of the Bharatas used to live, which essentially gives the country the modern name. We constitutionally call it India, that is Bharat. And hence, thereon we move towards the Saraswati civilization. Saraswati, I've spoken about it multiple times before on different platforms. Quite casually, people, those uninformed remarks about Saraswati being here, or being where, or questioning the very existence of Saraswati, making remarks like it's probably a myth or BJP fantasy, all those remarks, not indulging and investing heavily into scientific research. What stops one from, delving deep into the topic and understanding, if where the Saraswati River was. K.S. Valdezi, wrote a very fascinating report in 2016, which essentially brought together the textual, linguistic, archaeological, geological evidences, climate evidences, to establish that the modern, the river bed or the paleo bed, and was quite in line with what the modern Ganga River looks like. However, the question still stands on Saraswati, that how is it that Saraswati River vanished, or how is it that Saraswati River went to go Vinashana? Vinashan matlab khatam hona. Now, there are multiple thoughts and theories behind it. People say geological movements, heavy tectonic movements shifted the course of the river or the course of the source of water. There are still other people who say that the source was rainwater and monsoonal changes brought to it. But all those reasonings, we need to find a common ground, and that research essentially is going on, and hence it's not important to. Hence, it's important not to just criticize any conversation related to the river as mythical or fantastical, because you see evidences out there on the on the lands of Haryana. Even the modern what we call it Harappan civilization or Indus Valley civilization, the Saraswati or Sindhu Saraswati civilization essentially had one of the biggest mounds, or many biggest mounds were in the region of Haryana. So modern Haryana, which is in the north, there's Punjab. It bounds Delhi on 3 sides, and there's borders Rajasthan, and it UP skirts Yamuna skirts by the side and established and makes a border between Uttar Pradesh and Haryana. This region has essentially been climate-wise speaking, a semi-arid to arid region, where close to the Yamuna River you would find a lot of comparatively, the soil is more moist, and the water is abundant, so there will be a lot of rice cultivation these days. Regardless, this region has seen a lot of change in climate as well, and Saraswati River is drying up is an important factor in this entire process. Now, I told you about the biggest mounds of the civilization here in Haryana. It is also on these banks that the Vedas were written. The Vedas are the biggest, the most revered texts in Sanatan Dharma. And the Vedas were written on the banks of the Saraswati River. The Mahabharata, which is the biggest battle of right versus wrong, dharma versus adharma, was fought on these lands. And hence, in more ways than one, Haryana has been the very center of Indic civilization, the very center of dharma. It, however, lost somewhere, but it's important to realize, and those are modern constructs, those are modern stereotypes, people would just casually say. But from Indus Valley civilization, from Sindhu Saraswati civilization to Mahabharata period, Haryana was and established itself as the land of gods. Another reason why I call the book Land of the Gods is because the translation of the word Haryana. The region has been called by multiple names through history: Dharamkshetra, Kurukshetra, Bahudhanyak, which is the land of abundance, and then also Haryana. People pass uninformed remarks that Haryana, the name never existed, or the region never existed, or the state never existed. All those are wrong things, because 17th, 18th century maps make a clear mention. 13th century texts make a mention of Haryana being Delhi being a part of a land called Haryana. So the literal translation of the modern word Haryana is Hari plus Ayan, which is abode of Hari, or land of the gods. And hence the title of the book, Land of the Gods, the story of Haryana. The book is divided into 8 chapters, and I begin by telling you the story of what was happening in the 17th, 18th century Haryana. What were the powers? What were the power equations, which all people were negotiating for bigger political power, bigger clout, bigger dominance in the region. And from there, I move towards what is happening in modern day Haryana, that is 21st century. All of it is divided into 8 chapters. The first chapter is titled Jats, Sardars and Nawabs. I do want to point out that in this entire text, although the journey of the book, the book takes you from 17th century to 21st century, there are many instances and many notable anecdotes which I've written about from ancient India. So I do discuss the book. The book begins with Saraswati. The book begins with Bharata's tribe. The book begins by telling the story of Mahabharata. The book tells about different religions, different philosophical sets, different thought processes, different akhadas, different mutt, different social reforms movements, or other movements, other religious movements that have dominated this region. I make a story about, how Bhiwani essentially is called, or why it's called Chote Kashi. And not just Bhiwani for that matter. You go to different villages in Haryana, you will find some shrines here, some shrines there. You will find a lot of temples. Haryana is just full of a lot of temples. And then for wrestlers, which have in more ways than one represented Haryana now for a while, for them, Hanuman is just everything. So the entire setting that Haryana is, their beliefs, thought processes, God, faith is very central to the people making those conversations, the people getting into those people. It's central to civilization, it's central to the society. So the book begins with the first chapter from Jats, Sardars and Nawabs. It's from the Jats, Sardars and Nawabs tells about how during the decline of Mughal Empire, during the later half of Aurangzeb's age, there were many different political forces which had risen up. Notable among them were Jats, because they were, out there rebelling in the regions in the Braj Kshetra, modern Braj Kshetra. Then there were Sardar, the Sikhs had started organizing themselves and started extracting more political power and dominance. Then there were other Mughal kings, the Rohillas, the Afghans, and somewhere down the line, even Marathas joined the entire, tug of war. The second chapter is rightly titled Era of Anarchy. The chapter starts from 1761, which is where the third battle of Panipat took place in 1761. From 1761 till it ultimately became, came under the control of the English in 1803. In this time span, Haryana had sort of become a land of immense anarchy, because all of these political powers were embroiled in conflict with each other. So at you will find stories about Ghulam Qadir, you will find stories about Sikhs, you will find stories about say how the Marathas entered these lands. You will find stories about an Irish man establishing his principality in Haryana, and you would find about how the Marathas, the Sikhs, the Mughals, the British, the French, the Irishman George Thomas, the Bhatis from the Patiala region, which is modern Sirsa, were all in conflict with each other, essentially making this entire land, which was at one point, land of gods, or the center of Indic civilization, as a battleground of civilizations. And this essentially happened both from 7 to say 17th, 18th century, and even 20th century. The Haryana region has been suffering from the, it's been a consequence of defending Delhi. The third chapter starts from the third chapter is titled The First War. It goes from 1803 to 1857, where the British were now, the English East India Company was in control of these lands, and they started bringing new reforms and changing the entire administrative structure, bringing new judicial processes, and how the people adapted, or if not adapted, they revolted and rebelled against what was happening to their own set of opinions, ideas, their own systems of administration, their own systems of jurisprudence. So it was not an easy thing. It was not a cakewalk for English, the East India Company or the British, or how we would just casually say, because we tend to talk about history in terms of specific inflection points. However, those inflection points are probably written by historians specifically while they're telling their stories. But if you delve a little deeper, you explore a little more, you understand that it's never a case, it was not as easy as it looks like, or it's not as easy as it reads like in many books, many history books. There was immense conflict in Haryana. The local powers rebelled time and again, and won many times, but ultimately they were subdued to English finance, English arms, English politics, English administration. The fourth chapter is titled The Call for Freedom. It is from 1857 to 1947, where we talk about how Haryana essentially became, from 1857 to 1947, Haryana gained independence. And in this entire journey, there were many players in Haryana, there were many strong leaders in Haryana, there were many movements in Haryana, which Haryana also for some reason, and other people or historians casually don't give Haryanvis the credit for. For example, the Arya Samaj movement in Haryana picked up tremendous pace. It was widely accepted by people, and the impact of that same movement you see even in recent times. Similarly, Lala Lajpat Rai was active in the region. The modern DLF's founders, ancestors, DLF, the entire company is from Haryana, and it started back then. You also had Sir Chotu Ram. So, in Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister, unveiled the statue of Sir Chotu Ram in Rohtak region. People casually and very eagerly want to talk about Sir Chotu Ram as the Messiah of farmers, but very little is known about Sir Chotu Ram to just modern generation. And I make a clear mention in the book about different efforts that Sir Chotu Ram took and made to ensure that the peasants or the farmers, their lives could be improved just for better. Going further, I do talk about how the first Nobel Prize of Pakistan is credited in some way to Sir Chotu Ram. If it was not for Sir Chotu Ram's Peasant Welfare Fund, Pakistan's Nobel Prize would not have fructified. It would have been just a dream. Second, of course, I believe was Malala. Then I also make a mention about how Haryana's social structure was transforming in this phase. So in 1947, you see a lot of people migrating out of these lands and a lot of people coming to these lands. Towns back then were dominated by the Mughal elites, people who were loyal to the royal kingdom, or royal emperor, the Mughals. So you see a transition happening in 1947 where Pakistan, which was an Islamic republic, many Muslims left these lands for Pakistan. And the vacant land was taken by people coming from Punjab, which was then further from Lahore. So all these people, and that region of Pakistan was flourishing like anything. People, Punjabis or Khatri Hindus who were living on those lands, Sikhs toiled those lands, worked hard on them, tilled it, and made it flourishing, made made Lahore what Lahore was back in the day, made the entire Punjab region of Pakistan both rich in terms of, a land of abundance. But then all of a sudden, in 1947, they were told to just, pack your bags and go out of Pakistan if you want to save your lives. And so Kurukshetra, which was quite interesting thing. So Kurukshetra, which was, thousands of years ago, a battleground of civilization, now became the biggest camp to accommodate refugees coming in from Pakistan. These people were then allotted these lands, and they did incredibly well. So, and they are called Punjabis till date because they came from the Punjab of Pakistan, although a lot of them are Khatri Hindus. And that is where I've seen during course of research or conversations with people that it's tough for them to understand the difference between who is a Punjabi, is Punjabi a Hindu, is Punjabi a Sikh, so on and so forth. But casually speaking, Punjabis, a lot of them are Khatri Hindus and were mostly into merchant, and trade business. And they occupied, or they came and took the lands that were left by Muslims, and in time did really well for themselves, both in business, Bollywood, media. You go anywhere, you find Punjabis doing pretty well. So this change in the social structure of Haryana was happening in the phase between 1945 to 1951-52. Chapter number 5 is Scripting the Future, where I talk about how the modern state of Haryana came into formation. This is a very important chapter because this sets aside the idea that Haryana was a byproduct of the movement for Punjab statehood. When people say this, they very easily discount the fact a very strong movement for Haryana statehood that was going on during this age. Haryana was suffering due to the prominence or the lopsided development that was happening in the modern Punjab region. So what is Punjab today, Punjab of India today, was getting a bulk or a major share of developmental activities, education institute, roads, infrastructure, so on and so forth. Haryana, on the other hand, was suffering. So while Punjab statehood movement was going on, Haryana was also a center of a major movement wherein Arya Samajis, some other social organizations spearheaded by some remarkable people of back in the day, like Professor Sher Singh, Tao Devi Lal, and many others who spearheaded this entire movement that Haryana is a separate entity, has been a separate entity, and it deserves its due. So a major movement that was of Haryana statehood movement was also happening in Haryana during this phase between 1947 to 1966. And I make a mention of numerous things that had happened before also. And all this research, in fact, this book is a product of an effort by a lot of people who have shared these stories, shared notes, shared snippets, kept documentation of things here and there in order to just keep those memories, how Haryana as a modern region came about. Professors like Professor K.C. Yadav, Mr. S.C. Mittal, people like Dr. Buddha Prakash, they have been remarkable people back in the day who were associated probably with Kurukshetra University and elsewhere too, have done a lot of research and writing of those days. In fact, in 60s and 70s, Mr. Munilal wrote a book, Haryana's Road to Prosperity, quite helpful in understanding what Haryana was back in the day. What was there something in Haryana 1970s? In fact, Mr. Sumer is also joined kindly in the audience. He makes I interviewed him and got into conversation with him where he shared a story of how in 1950s, 60s, the modern Hisar, Fatehpur Sirsa region was just a semi-arid land, so much so that there used to be dust storms. So people grow their grapes today, people grow do organic cultivation there, but only 50, 60 years ago, that land was very close to, a desert. And that is where Haryana is coming from. That is where the Haryana's trajectory is from. People here have lived on limited things. Village communities have been small and very interdependent, and their systems of administration and jurisprudence have been very both minimalistic and so to say rudimentary, but very exceptional, because it was quite like, which I make a mention of in the in a previous talk. It was very close to a modern corporate structure where somebody gets elevated to a higher position in the social hierarchy only because of respect he draws or she draws from people around or the people of the community. That is how the entire caste system works. But of course, it has been politicized in modern days. But I do, many times during the book, make a mention of how or where Haryana essentially is coming from. Then chapter 6 is the three Lals, where and it's picked the modern name popularly well, that Haryana's political history has been about the three Lals, because from 1966 till say 2000s, Haryana's politics has been dominated by, or was dominated by, the three Lals: Tau Devi Lal, Bhajan Lal, and Bansi Lal. Bansi Lal is called as the early architect of Haryana because he was in Haryana during that phase of 1970s where coffers were rich, thanks to Bansi Lal's association with then Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. The state government was given the freedom, or the state government took many initiatives which which define the modern state of Haryana, which essentially irrigated those lands which were desert-like for the longest time. And then there was Bhajan Lal also. So this phase essentially is of the three Lals. But then slowly I move the book. So chapter 7 is Chaudhar, which further discusses politics, and chapter 8 is Rise and Rise. Now, let me tell you where I'm coming from. Haryana has been a region of ancient glory, as described by it being called land of the gods, it being Bahudhanyak, it being a land of riches, it being the center of Indic civilization, it being the land where the battle of Dharma was fought, it being the land where modern, very prominent civilizations live. And from there, it became a land of anarchy. Now, anarchy is when, so Islamic invasions began in 7th century. So I have discussed ancient glory of the region of Haryana. From ancient glory, Haryana entered a phase of anarchy. So that anarchy began somewhere around the 7th, 8th century, where this land of Indic civilization essentially became a battleground of civilizations through onslaughts. So you see Delhi Sultanate phase, you see the Mughals phase. Delhi, Agra were the regions where the power centers were. In order to reach those power centers, in order to establish your dominance in those power centers, one will have to come through the lands which go from, say, Ambala, Ambala, Kurukshetra, Shahabad, there'll be Taraudi, there'll be Karnal, Kunjpura, Panipat, Sonipat. All these places became battlegrounds. There's some small, big skirmish or a battle that has happened in these lands. So what was back in the day a land of riches or a land of prosperity or a land of civilization, Dharma, became battlegrounds. You will see some, and what would the villages or small communities then be doing? Either they would involve in some battle of a scale. If they're not involving in any battles or fights, they would have to leave their lands and flee for safety and security. Probably when the battle is over, probably when situations are, it's a little in peace, people would come back till those lands again. So from that ancient glory, Haryana became a land of anarchy. And one of the most, in fact, the book starts with the first story of a Satnami rebellion. Now, Satnami rebellion was one of the most powerful rebellions that took place in Aurangzeb's era. And that rebellion happened in South Haryana region of Narnaul. A friend here wrote about if I've written about Yadavas. Of course I have, because you see, Haryana could be divided into Deshwali belt, and GT Road belt. One is Pagadi belt, and of course there is a Ahirwal belt. So Ahirwals and Ahirs and Yadavas, I've written about them in the book. And then in modern age, what is happening in contemporary Haryana, through a lot of things that have happened, the change that has come around in Haryana over the last few decades, Haryana is finally getting to realize its potential. I remember I wrote an article few years back where I spoke about Haryana should be investing itself in establishing foreign relations and diplomatic relations with other countries and some sort of cooperations. I spoke about how women should be given their due, give them proper education opportunities, give them employment opportunities, take care of maternal women health. I spoke about immense potential in agriculture, but Haryana should be moving away from just agriculture and get involved in modern industry. Apart from Gurgaon, there should be modern industry coming up elsewhere too. Jind is a vacant land. Jind is an opportunity land. There's Narnaul belt, which is an opportunity. There is, the entire GT Road belt still has immense potential. However, thanks to, a byproduct of green revolution, Haryana's lands have slowly started to degrade. But then one has to, and the governments also have to consistently think about it. I was glad to find that in terms of foreign cooperation, the current government has been taking numerous steps in the direction by organizing. Recently, they organized Africa Dialogue, an independent dialogue that was an initiative of the Chief Minister Manolal Khattar. He wanted to, there's a conversation beginning where Haryana is partnering and talking to independent partners in Africa. Similarly, there are other cooperation, other interactions that are happening. So, and then of course, thanks to education and thanks to exposure of the previous generation, modern Haryanvis are now getting into understanding the possibilities that the 21st century offers. Land became valuable, industry was doing well, slowly money started to trickle down, people now get better education facilities. There are new opportunities in Gurgaon and elsewhere too, that Haryanvis are slowly starting to realize their potential in, say, they could be doing good in Bollywood. Manushi Chillar is a fine example. There are stereotypical examples about Haryana is a patriarchal society, or people casually just say that women are oppressed or whatever anyone wants to make a remark. Yet at the same time, there are also alternate stories about Haryanvi women doing very well on national and international pageants. Haryanvi women doing very well in politics. In fact, think about Shanu Devi or think about Sushma Swaraj. Sushma Swaraj was a Haryanvi. Shanu Devi, one of the first, I believe, the first woman speaker of the assembly, legislative assembly. Then, so Haryana just focusing on one part is not, one side is not the right thing to do. Of course, a lot of change is happening and a lot more needs to be done as well. But this change is setting in. This exposure is bringing around the change in Haryana. And with right education and employment opportunities, I truly believe it is going to be Haryana's century. One, because of the vicinity to Delhi. Two, the airports. Three, the urban infrastructure, the road infrastructure, the education opportunities, exposure. Haryanvis are finally getting to understand that, it just, or veering a little bit away from the obsession, I say, with the government jobs. However, it does still exist, but more needs to be done on that direction and offer opportunities in private sector. And be it film industry, I've seen some incredible people doing very well in music industry, giving, if not challenging at the level in terms of economics, but bringing products, bringing music videos, films, which are making a mark and which are being accepted by people or Haryanvis all over. Ashwini Chaudhary, Juhi Chawla, Pariniti Chopra, Randeep Hooda. Randeep Hooda is a big name himself in Bollywood and has essentially been the brand ambassador of Haryana. Manushi Chillar, Kalista Dhankad, and then you see Haryanvis doing well. Haryanvis have been pretty well in politics, by the way, always have been, making a noticeable impact in national politics, be it from Bansi Lal to Bhajan Lal or Devi Lal, who became the Deputy Prime Minister of India, and Sushma Swaraj, and so on and so forth. So that is how. So this is the gist of the talk, and I'd like to stop here. That Haryana is coming from a region, or coming from a time where it was one of the most glorious lands or glorious regions of India, but it fell prey, or it fell victim to certain things, and right after that, a lot of anarchy prevailed. But now is the time that Haryana, through women education or initiatives for women, through education, through opportunities, through exposure, through more money, through utilizing what Delhi offers, or what the National Capital Territory region offers, Haryana is finally coming to understand that somewhere down the line it can attain its ancient glory, but no economic growth can just be only about finances or parameters. It has to be very sustainable, and that is where Haryanvis need to come together, genuinely get into conversation about bringing that change, genuinely get into conversation about what is good for Haryanvis, what needs to be done, how that change needs to be brought about. So with that, I remember as a typical Haryani, I'll close the talk with saying, Desh Same Desh Haryana, Jiddu Dahi Ka Khana. Thank you very much.